Aldo Laubscher, South Africa Country Manager at Visa. Very interesting last 10 years with e-commerce experiencing extremely high growth. And even with the recent setbacks with COVID-19 and the pandemic that followed, this hasn't stopped any of the growth trends we've seen in the e-commerce space. Also very interesting to see the acceleration towards digital payments, which has intensified significantly in recent times. And there's a massive growth in the number of ways to pay or to be paid. At Visa, we've taken very much note of this approach and this process, and we're evolving our approach as e-commerce and commerce is evolving. Today, I'll share with you 5 key trends in digital payments and the developments in the e-commerce sector. So please enjoy the discussion with me. If we look at some of the trends, I'm going to start with the first one around digital payments, which is that experiences are becoming much more diversified. And it's driven by an abundance of choice. Now, what we mean by abundance of choice is if you look at cash as an experience, it's pretty consistent, and there's not a high velocity of variant experiences. Where in the digital space, depending on where you buy, who you buy from, when you buy, and where you are, there are many ways to transact, and you can dip, you can swipe, you can tap, you can scan, and many other things. Then you can go and you can have this experience face-to-face, or you can have the experience online or in-app. So very, very diversified and lots of choice. We also see that new players are fueling this diversification as they bring a lot more choice to everyone. And they're creating a cycle of very diverse capabilities, which instead of simplifying many times, it actually makes the experience more complex. But it could be very enjoyable for the person experiencing it, because user experiences are being invested to significantly. And it depends on the merchant you shop with and on which channel you choose to engage. We also see very clearly that the payment experience doesn't necessarily drive the consumer behavior. It's more about the choice the consumer has, where they want to buy, what their merchant relationship is, what availability there are of products, and at the end of the day, how they interact with those products and services. So there's a lot of considerations in the experience that is driving that consumer behavior. So the payment choice becomes secondary, and the experience, even though it's very important, becomes secondary. Now at Visa, what we believe and see clearly is that where buyers meet with sellers and how they choose to transact is what we have to solve for. And that then becomes very important in our consideration of the channel, the mode of purchase, and the ecosystem we use for transacting and getting their payments done. Now, digitization is accelerating the proliferation of options and way beyond physical cards. And that's probably the second key trend we see. So if you look at South Africa, there's an enormous opportunity still to displace cash, because more than 53% of transactions and payments at point of sale is still cash. Now with COVID-19 that occurred and it's still affecting our lives, we see that more individuals want to transact in a digital way. They don't want to be in a touch environment, but rather a touchless environment. We see that tapping to pay and relying on e-commerce has become a norm. It's very interesting to see how big e-commerce has grown, but also by how much contactless has taken flame in the last 18 to 20 months. It is amazing. The growth and the number of ways in which we do our payments is also interesting. So the consumer's first experience is quite important, because if that's enjoyable and it's easy to use and it's predictable, they will come back. And it doesn't always involve a card, obviously. It now, in many times, involve a digital experience. And what this does is it creates a bit of a blur in the mind of how these transactions should be handled in store as well as outside a store, and the whole omni-channel approach of do you pay up front, do you pay in dearing, or do you pay on receipt, are becoming choices. And that then also shows us that there's a clear piece where people access and interact with money in different ways, and that will change. What we're seeing is that interoperability and standards will become extremely important. It's important today, but it will become more important. Why? Because when you get into this digital world and you want to enable participation in a secure and efficient way, you need to have standards and interoperability so there's predictability that creates more trust. Now, that said, to get to that point, it gets me to my third trend, which is that payments infrastructure is modernizing at an alarmingly quick pace. And we all need to be very cognizant of that and keep with the pace. So governments have seen in general that when they invest in digital payments, that there's massive macroeconomic benefits. Some have seen GDP growth of as much as 19 basis points in digitizing their payments infrastructure and modernizing infrastructure. So it's very, very important. Underpinning that is a focus of making sure that digital payments becomes accessible to citizens, but more than just that, also to small businesses and in the interaction between them. And therefore, many governments are looking at national payment schemes or investing in real-time payments infrastructure, or looking at the capability of open banking. Now, at Visa, we actually refer to open banking more as a form of open data, because at the end of the day, money is becoming the new data. And the data around digital money is going to be very important. We'll talk about that very shortly. But in terms of regulation, we believe that if it's done right, if it's done in collaboration with the industry and the trends that's driven by the demand and supply, that regulation will accelerate innovation across the value chain, which means that digital payments will become a commodity, yes, but there's new opportunities around it because of the very robust digital payments infrastructures that there will be. Individual players can now come with more flexible models to enable and to take the transaction beyond basic processing or clearing and settlement into this overlay world of value-added services, data, intelligence, security, risk management, and more, to make the transaction more accessible, more manageable, more predictable, but also more secure and trustworthy. So that brings me to my fourth point and trend that we're seeing, and this is that the line between money and data, as I mentioned earlier, is blurry. Clearly, physical money will be evolving into digital money, and digital money will be evolving into data. Now, to make data useful, it cannot exist in isolation in components. It needs to be in a space where attributes of data complement each other. Now, that means we need to speak to the sustainability of that value of that data. So how long do you need it, and is it still relevant over time? The proprietary of that data, is it relevant now, and is it real and applicable? And also expansiveness of that data. Can it be utilized in a very efficient and predictive way that's of benefit across a network that can help to mold a digital experience that for the consumer is worthwhile and makes the payment experience, as we said earlier, a secondary experience. It doesn't influence that experience with the merchant and with the interaction of the seller. I think extracting data that's of highest value is important in open data systems, but when we extract those data elements, we need to be very clear on the use and how to be managed. So from a Visa perspective, open data for us is a key in terms of extracting the value data, but it's also underpinned by a couple of core beliefs. I think one of them very clearly is that open data will grow in many ways, and it must be underpinned by solid, trusted partnerships to contribute to that value. How data is exchanged and the source of future data is going to be important, because those who have proprietary knowledge and control over the process of the data will have some sort of competitive advantage, and it needs to be managed in a very wise and careful way. Also, companies solving for increasing complexity and consent and security needs, we believe will have a lot of benefit and also a competitive advantage, because that will help protect the data around the consumer, around the small business, around the entity that's trading in a way that harnesses both value but also protection across the value chain. Now that brings me to a fifth trend, which is also very, very interesting, is that the payments ecosystem is becoming more flexible and expansive. Now, with the points I mentioned earlier, this is probably a given, because as we go through the value chain, it is clear that it's become so complex that new players will most of the time focus on very specific components of that value chain to deliver additional value, new experiences, and create the plugins and flexibility that makes the experience just more rich. Now, the number of participants in the ecosystem is expanding, obviously, but the demand for capabilities and those user experiences and the standards associated with those are becoming more and more important. Now, the demand for new players and their operating models means that we need to find ways of delivering these services in a more modular or disaggregated manner, where in the past it was aggregate and deliver as a total. Now it's partner modularity, so you can bring good experiences, strong experiences with predictability around the payment. I think the payments unbundling demand also asks three questions. Is it trustworthy? In other words, is the capabilities that these additional layers bring coupled with security and reliability? And is it predictable, so it can create that trust? Is it convenient? Can you use it in any channel? Is it fully omni-channel? And is there choice? Buy now, pay later, installments, pay on delivery, pay up front, pay on order, etc. So that choices in terms of how we enrich the payment as it unbundles is extremely important. Now let's have a look how these digital trends have been influencing e-commerce and how e-commerce has been influencing the digital drive. So as the world becomes increasingly more digital, e-commerce obviously is driving some of that. And what we've seen is, as I mentioned at the start, COVID-19 and the associated pandemic has not slowed down e-commerce in any way. In actual fact, it's pushed the e-commerce drive and trend upwards to the extent that we believe by the end of 2024, we will hit a global 7 trillion volume across e-commerce in sales, which is a massive number. And that has been fast-tracked significantly through the pandemic. Now, in sub-Saharan Africa, which is one of the smaller regions globally from an e-commerce perspective, we've also seen some really steady and consistent growth. We've seen the rise in e-commerce users over the last 18 months jump by 5%, which is pretty significant. And in a recent paper published by Visa Consulting Analytics, we've also seen that there's some interesting moves in the top market contributors. So in the last 3 years, South Africa and Nigeria remained the top two performers in the market, with Kenya that was traditionally number 3. But what's interesting is in the last year, Ghana has joined Kenya on an equal third place as a contributor to significant growth in e-commerce. And what we see is that there's a couple of drivers in these e-commerce elements that drives behavior in these countries, but also drives growth and momentum across the continent. One of them is cross-border transactions, because up to half of the transactions today on e-commerce is across borders. And that is even though we see a lot of volume in South Africa and Nigeria domestic markets, which is pretty mature. The rest of the region is driving a significant drive on e-commerce intra-regionally, which is a really, really interesting phenomenon. Secondly, we're also seeing that e-commerce is driven by mostly retail goods and professional services, but there's some strong growth coming out of the investment sector, the accounting sector, business-to-business payments, as well as bill payments, as they become more enabled for e-commerce capabilities. These categories seem to be growing at a nice pace. We're also seeing that mobile phones are the preferred choice for digital access. And that's very interesting given that you're sitting with two markets like South Africa and Nigeria, is traditionally had quite solid online capabilities via computer, laptop, and then normal browser technologies. So mobile phones and the on digital access is driving a real key message that m-commerce, the new e-commerce, will be and is the primary access point for digital commerce transactions across the continent. We're also seeing that payment facilitators has become a key and critical catalyst for digital payments. If we say payment facilitators, then we talk about the last 5 years, where payment facilitators really has jumped to the fore to become enablers of quick e-commerce digital payment website uptake, the enablement of small businesses in that environment, and the simplification of the payment experience. And again, the payment experience is secondary, but because these payment facilitators have come in and have focused on specific niche elements, they've managed to drive up the experience levels, which drives the market. And it's a very good thing, and we're going to need that to continue. A core and fundamental element has been fraud protection, and it's key to remaining trust with consumers during this period and going forward. Now, what we see is that physical payments versus digital payments are still got a very interesting coexistence. But digital payments and the growth thereof needs to be sustained with strong controls, very good education and communication with consumers to avoid phishing, man-in-the-middle attacks, and those type of things, so that the e-commerce experience remains true to its intent of simplifying the digital payment experience for consumers as a whole. It is safe to use their cards, and they feel safe to use their cards today. We need to make sure they feel safe to use those cards in digital form and factor going forward. Now, interesting, we spoke about the intra-regional piece and the drive of e-commerce in the intra-regional space. And that bears the question, what will the benefits of e-commerce be if we look at the Africa Continental Free Trade Area and the Free Trade Agreement? Now, in its essence, the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement and Area has a call to action for all stakeholders to ensure that jobs and inclusive growth potential for the intra-Africa trade area is developed and captured. And it encourages African policymakers to pursue various opportunities presented at multiple levels to achieve this. Now, what we see is e-commerce actually is a fundamental and glaring opportunity for immense growth in these Africa economies, including South Africa, so all the way across sub-Saharan Africa and into North Africa. And it places a opportunity in front of governments to benefit people in enabling simple engagement and comprehensive, predictable, and trusted engagement with e-commerce as a capability. So again, from a Visa perspective, we've done a global study in our Visa Global Merchant e-commerce survey, and it showed an interesting trend. E-commerce is a solution that enables intra-regional trade, as I mentioned earlier, but here's the stat. A large majority, about 87% of all merchants interviewed, believed that if they expand online and into new markets with that online capability, this would be one of their biggest growth opportunities as a business. And this is on the back of technology that will assist them to do it faster, more predictable, and in a consistent way. And we see all retailers seizing the opportunity also now to go into this more e-commerce, non-face-to-face driven environment so that they can mine new potential buyers and clients. Now, intra-regional and global e-commerce trade remains small still. It's not that big compared to the face-to-face environment at the moment, and still cash is a major front that we can tackle with those. But if we look at the obstacles to e-commerce, one that I would like to highlight is this ability to bring standards into the play and interoperability, because that fulfills a promise, hopefully, for spurring economic growth and help players partner in a way that will drive growth. Now, if we do that, we will attract additional investment. We will also help support national development goals in Africa. And what we will do is, if we get that right, we will drive a domestic environment that will also be open and ready to adopt. And then the two will work together, because you've got domestic adoption, it'll drive inter-regional adoption, which, if the trust is there, we would see accelerated growth. Now, on the back of that, we also see the rise of cross-border digital commerce as a door for many new opportunities and sales strategies and the management of logistics and many other things. Small businesses in particular, especially in the informal sector, find it very, very difficult to interact with the formal sector, especially when it gets to payment, supply chain, delivery. And that in itself gives a great opportunity to payment enablers like banks, fintechs, and platforms to partner with these environments, these ecosystems, these supply chains, to make the payment enablement digital, take cash out to a level where it's appropriate or totally out, and then bring an experience that is trusted to those environments. Now, in conclusion, if we look at just the main points, I would like to just highlight a couple. Our strategy at Visa is to open our network to support a broad range of players that are developing new commerce experiences, and that means transitioning into digital, various channels, various environments. I think secondly, we do this in many ways. And as an organization that's growing and evolving, as all of us has to do in the business environment, these type of strategies would include investment, partnership, but most importantly, engagement with our communities, with our ecosystem partners, with our regulators, and other players in the ecosystem to make sure we get this going and working to beneficial way for all. There are many examples of where we've done this in various countries on the continent as well as globally. And to support our strategies in this area, we're also looking at traditional versus new financial services companies and the products that they develop to help in the ecosystem. And that means partnering or investment or engagement, as I mentioned earlier, with the aim to reach the unserved and the unbanked, consumers and small businesses. I think at the end of the day, what's important is, if we look at what we've done thus far, the work we've done has fostered some more simpler way of accessing digital, easier ways of accessing the digital environment. And from a merchant perspective, a partnership perspective, we've got more than 40 partners already in Sub-Saharan Africa helping us with this very important drive. At Visa, we also have a published COVID-19 tracker, which highlights a couple of effects from the pandemic. And I think one of the key ones that comes out for consumers and small business across Africa is that it reveals a strong shift towards online commerce. Cash transactions are being replaced by digital payments at a very quick rate. And we see that as cash grows, digital is now growing at very similar to quicker rates, which is very interesting. I think lastly, I would want to also just highlight again that because of the COVID-19 scenario, it is very, very important that we get a couple of basics still in the back of our mind right. We need to bring that and continue to bring the capability for consumers to interact with their merchants and their businesses and the sellers they interact with in a touchless way. So continuing to roll out contactless devices and technology, scan technology is going to be very important. It's important for banks to continue the drive for contactless cards issuance, but also move that into the virtual card environment, where they can virtually in a digital way deliver payments to the consumer world, to the small business world, and also to the more corporate and business world as that evolves into the new digital age as well. And then lastly, merchants need to find very clever ways of enabling online payment platforms in their sites. Now, this means partnering in a better way or an interesting way with payment facilitators, fintechs, banks, platforms to bring that new experience and make sure that the provider of the payment understands that they're supporting the payment. I thank you for your time today. It was an absolute pleasure sharing this with you, and I hope this brings a picture of how digital payments and e-commerce is changing the way we interact with payments, we interact with merchants, and we interact in our daily lives. Thank you.